Okay. All right. So let's get the event started. I want to welcome everybody here to tonight's event, Forced Labor in Supply Chains, Actions and Impacts to Advance Equity. Welcome to all here in person, and also welcome everybody online. This event is hybrid. And I want to thank, of course, the New York AIA chapter and the Center for Architecture for their support and sponsorship of the event. And special thanks to Samara Kaba and Joe Corbin for all of their efforts, of course. My name is Nadine Berger. I'm the co-chair of the Social Science and Architecture Committee here in the New York AIA chapter. I'm also an architect here in New York, and I work as a sustainability senior manager and global associate at AECOM's Innovation Laboratory, iLab, where I focus on research and development and innovation initiatives to deliver high performance and net zero carbon projects. Personally, and through work with AECOM's iLab, as well as my work as the incoming co-chair of the committee, I care about and focus on the intersection of environmental and social responsibility, and I'm determined to be part of the solution towards a more inclusive, sustainable, healthy, and just built environment, and hope to inspire others to do the same. Brief history of the committee that I am the co-chair of, and we have a lot of members here today. Great to see the event is organized by the committee, and I want to thank my co-chair, Kwan Chen, and the members involved in the planning of the event. It took a lot of people to get this event organized. Just to mention a few: Evie Klein, Ines Raposo, Melissa Marsh, and Sarah Grant. Thank you all. Actually, just to talk about the committee a little bit, we are an interdisciplinary alliance connecting social science and architecture, and we are focusing on research approaches and innovative tools in the field for potentially transforming how we understand and shape the built environment. And we are a committee of really professionals of diverse backgrounds: architecture, engineering, library sciences, design research, etc. And we're really exploring how this intersection between social science and architecture can be strengthened to advance the practice of architecture. We are meeting every fourth Friday of every month as a committee, 8:30 to 10 a.m. in the morning. It's a hybrid event too. You can join online or in person. Everybody is welcome. And we have Melissa Marsh here, who's going to be our moderator today as well, who is the co-founder of the committee in 2016. This three-part series that we are talking about today is the third event, aims to shed light on the social inequalities caused by forced labor in our building material supply chain. And don't fret if you missed the first or second event. All of these events have been recorded, as this one is also being recorded and is available online to be viewed again. And we also have a summary on our committee website of the events. I want to give a little recap of both events just for your benefit, so we're not starting from scratch. So I want to just talk about the first event for a minute, where we were joined by guest speaker Bridget Abraham, a Design for Freedom project manager at Grace Farms, and we're so glad Bridget is here as well. Thanks for coming. She's been here for all three events, actually, so it's wonderful to have you back. She introduced the Design for Freedom movement, founded by Sharon Prince, and she explained how the movement raises awareness about the pervasiveness of forced and child labor in the building material supply chain. She also shared how Design for Freedom explores the risks of this humanitarian crisis and highlighted ways in which architects and building professionals can take action towards transparency through tools and resources made available by Grace Farms, such as the publicly available toolkit. You can download that online. Just a few facts that Design for Freedom shared in that talk. 28 million people are trapped in forced labor today. The construction industry lags other industries, such as the food and clothing industries, in awareness and action. And one way to address, of course, forced labor is on-site labor, but that's only half of the equation. Forced labor in the building supply chain must also be addressed. And that's really kind of the cradle to gate time when you mine the materials, manufacture them, and get them into the building. There are over 1 million people estimated in modern slavery in the United States alone. And that's across all industries. So these numbers are were pretty eye-opening for those who hadn't heard about it until then. There's also a report that came out in 2020 where Design for Freedom put together a comprehensive list of also materials that are have the highest potential of slavery. Those are here on the screen, and those are in-depth reported on in the toolkit that I mentioned. The Design for Freedom toolkit is downloadable online, and I think it came online at the second summit, and that must have been 2 years ago at this point. And it's a really great resource, comprehensive resource for design and construction professionals to implement ethical, forced labor-free material sourcing strategies into their practices. So really worthwhile looking up the website. It's incredibly resourceful, and we hear more about it today as well. The second event, we were joined, we called it Examples of a Humanely Built Environment, and we were joined by 2 architects who were presenting their projects that were part of the Design for Freedom pilot projects by Design for Freedom. So these are projects that will follow the guidelines and using the toolkits and the guidance of the working group as well that is active with the Design for Freedom project. And we heard from them and gained valuable insights into not only the successes, but also the challenges that they encountered in the process of designing and building with ethically sourced materials. And the goal was, of course, for other practitioners to really learn from them in their own journey. Nina Cook-John presented a project that opened in 2021, the Harriet Tubman Monument in New York. We heard about how she approached the communities that it was built for, but also how she approached the sourcing of the materials. Diana Kellogg, New York-based architect, presented the Rajkumari Ratnavati Girls' School in India, which was completed in 2021. And we heard from her, in a very different environment, we heard from her how she approached the community that she built for in India, and also worked with local labor that helped build the project. So again, this is just a short, abbreviated recap. If you want to hear more about it online, the online recording is available. And lastly, to set the stage for our speakers, and I'm handing it over to Melissa in a minute, I'm just pulling up these numbers again from the International Labor Organization. These numbers are real, and they're representing a cross-section through all industries, and our industry is just one part of the whole picture, but it's not a pretty picture. And while our industry is not the only one where the products we use are potentially made by unfree labor and unfree and inhumane conditions, we as an industry haven't paid much attention to the fact until very recently, in part to the efforts of raising awareness by Design for Freedom. The topic is clearly ripe for the industry to acknowledge that there is a problem and to start thinking about the solutions. However, nothing is easy with this topic, and not the definitions of the different kinds of human exploitation that defines slavery or forced labor, not the root causes that put humans in these conditions, and certainly not the solutions that would actually improve the labor conditions of the impacted global population. It's a humanitarian crisis, it's a geopolitical dilemma, and an economic system problem, one where the balance of wanting products for pennies in the global north is answered by working for pennies in the global south. And it's also been dubbed the slavery discount that makes our products more affordable. But of course, we're not fooled. We know that forced labor and unfair conditions happen also in the global north. And we don't have to look far, like we saw over 1 million people in the United States alone are working under modern slavery conditions. All right, so the entire topic, tackling the issue to improve the working conditions of towards eliminating forced labor altogether on our level as planners and researchers and humans, is just incredibly complex, and really sometimes it feels bigger than our own reach, practices reach, or our network reach. So we acknowledge that these are complexities that are really tricky, and that we know that we won't solve the issue overnight. Not with our next project, not maybe with the next 2. And we know that that can also be very demotivating to even start to look for solutions. So, but we do want with this series not only further raise awareness and support Design for Freedom in their efforts, but also through the experience of our guest speakers today, start something. And there may be many trials and errors with attempts before we see impact. It's not the first time that we identified a major problem where the solutions came in slow, hint climate change. So, but it shouldn't stop us from starting somewhere. And whether that's going to be a top-down in our supply chain or a bottom-up working with the communities, what we want to support here today really is to stimulate and cultivate a discourse on the topic on both the conceptual and pragmatic measures to foster a paradigm shift towards enhanced human rights conditions in general and for us in our procurement process in the construction resources. So we hope that the event today inspires you to take that critical first step after hearing from our guest speakers tonight. And I want to hand it over to Melissa to introduce our guest speakers.
Thank you, Nadine, for that introduction, and it's a pleasure to be with you this evening. I'm Melissa Marsh. As mentioned, I am co-founder of the Social Science and Architecture Committee. I am delighted for this evening's presentation for the two previous programs that we've been putting on this topic. I'm also thankful for being asked to be the moderator. I have to confess I have a bit of imposter syndrome when it comes to being the moderator, as this is not a topic that I am particularly expert in. And as I was reflecting on that, I thought a few things. One, as architects, we are often taught that we should know everything, that we have so many areas of expertise. And part of the purpose of the Social Science and Architecture Committee is to recognize that there are different folks with different schools and with different areas of expertise, and sometimes you need to call a professional. In the area of architecture and social science, sometimes you should call a social scientist, and that our committee is both about the overlaps and the differences here. And I really appreciate Nadine's passion that we can bring to this topic, not the knowing of knowledge, but the heart of the passion around a topic and learn and discover in that capacity. And I really think that that is what we're here to talk about today in the third chapter of this series, which is moving from the passion, from the knowing to the doing. And I'm excited to learn from our panelists because I'm not the expert, but we have some experts in the room and we have a community of folks who are helping us think much more directly about this topic to move through some of the taboos that might make it hard to address these topics in our day-to-day work or in the practice of architecture. And so we have a fabulous lineup for you this evening. We will hear first from Billy Faircloth, who is co-founder and research director of Built Buildings Lab. And she'll be sharing some of the experiments and work that they have been doing. We will then hear from Pins Brown, who's here virtually and dialing in from the UK. So she's literally pulling an all-nighter for us. And she is currently a freelance consultant on business and human rights. She is the chair for the UK-based Food Network for Ethical Trade. And she'll also be talking to us about the things that are going on around the world. As Nadine mentioned, sometimes the inaction around something can be disheartening, and so we need to pull the resources from around the world so that we can have those small wins and have acknowledgement of that. And then finally, we'll be hearing from Sarah Grant, who's truly the anchor leg of this relay, in that she is a practicing architect here based in New York, and really talking about how we put this into our practice and what we might be doing on Tuesday morning differently than we did this morning. She is AIA, a LEED and ALEP qualified, and a design partner at MBB Architects. And so the way this is going to run is I'm going to let each of our fabulous panelists come up and spend a few minutes presenting their work, their perspective, to kind of give you the foundation for the conversation. So they'll come up one at a time. I'll have a little number there to help make them on time, on speed. And then we'll come up and convene a panel discussion. In the panel discussion, you will also be invited to ask questions. So prepare those questions, and then we will be able to address both my questions and your questions. So please help me welcome, and this is going to be in a different order. Sorry. Please help me welcome Billy Faircloth.
Hello. It's great to see all of you, and thank you again for having us here to talk about our work. So yes, I'm the co-founder and research director of the Buildings Lab, but I'm also formally the research director at Kieran Timberlake and a partner there. And with members of the Kieran Timberlake Research Group, I worked alongside Phil Bernstein of Yale Architecture and Kaylee Howdenborough-Happold and others. It was a rather large, robust team on a project that we titled Labor Exploitation Risk Calculation Methodology. So I'm going to share that with you. I'm going to share with you what we did. I'll share with you the lessons we learned. But I want to begin first just framing the problem. So we've already begun framing the problem tonight. We know that we're talking about how people experience labor exploitation when they're forced to work for little or no wages. So labor exploitation can include human trafficking and modern slavery. And modern slavery is defined by the International Labor Organization as situations of exploitation that a person cannot refuse or leave because of threats of violence, coercion, deception, and or abuse of power. So within a building's life cycle, and that's what we're talking about, right? We're talking about the entire life cycle of a building. We might find instances of forced labor and modern slavery occurring during material extraction, processing, manufacturing, construction. Given the number of supply chains involved, and we've already heard about the complexity, but given the number of supply chains involved in building construction and the lack of data, whole building labor exploitation risk accounting, the likelihood that forced labor is somewhere inside the materials that you're choosing, it presents a level of complexity that may be insurmountable. We began trying to answer this question, understanding that this could be insurmountable. So our project aimed to develop a calculation method for designers to assess the risk or likelihood of forced labor in building materials manufacturing. And we reasoned that by using available data sets, current data sets, any data sets that we could get our hands on that told us something about forced labor and where it's occurring, that this method could in fact empower designers to prioritize socially sustainable materials during the design process. So our study question, what is a method for calculating labor exploitation risk applicable to the building industry? And we were trying to understand basically labor exploitation risk, or LER. So our team, I want to speak a little bit about our team. It included academics, architectural and engineering practitioners, people with backgrounds in social life cycle assessment, computer science, but we also were able to engage industry for peer review, and we engaged experts to really look deeply into this calculation methodology because we did in fact successfully complete, after a year, complete a proof of concept. We talked with people in logistics or supply chain management, law and policy, data science, human trafficking, and social responsibility to just talk to us about what they were seeing based on the results of our proof of concept. Now, why did we do this? Or I should say, what framed or emboldened us to even think that there could be a labor exploitation risk methodology? Well, the other thing you should know about our team is that we have a background in life cycle assessment, and many members on our team were part of efforts to build tools that allowed architects and designers to associate impact information with modeled elements. And what I'm referring to there is building information modeling life cycle assessment. So for instance, Kieran Timberlake developed the tool Tally. And what we're doing there is basically saying how much of stuff do you have in your building? What's our bill of materials? And if we have impact information, and impact information can come in the form of impact of emissions to land, air, and sea through different pathways. The one we know the best is embodied carbon. So if we have the amount of stuff we have and the impact of that stuff, then we can know something about how good or bad we're doing. So environmental life cycle assessment is something that's grown, really grown as a way of us engaging climate action. Social life cycle assessment also has a pathway. It has a series of indicators, and we can engage social life cycle assessment impact categories as well. But we were really encouraged. We thought, could we do the same here? Could we get data associated with modeled elements, and then in some way during the design process have a way of understanding the modeled elements, the amount of materials, and then the proxy impacts? It seems rather reasonable to start there. Unfortunately, here was our answer. Because after all, our aim is to reduce or prevent exploitation, and what we found is that this method was unlikely to actually result in what we were all after. The method was unlikely to reduce or prevent labor exploitation due to issues with data quality and current data quality and ground truthing. So let me just tell you a little bit about data quality. So we found in the data a number of limitations or sources of limitations, including things like timeliness or when this data was collected. We were working specifically with Global Slavery Index data. We were also working with the International Trade Union Confederation's ITUC violations of rights ratings that uses the Freedom of Association indicator. We looked at that data and had a way of associating it with modeled elements. But there was also issues of representation within the data. Are we actually able to represent marginalized and remote groups? Are we able to really see the entire supply chain? The answer was no. In fact, we could only represent 19 building materials based on other data that we were using. We weren't completely looking at all the social impact considerations, child labor, discrimination, occupational health, safety, fair wages, and freedom of association. We didn't have data sets for all of a complete list of social topics. And we also weren't able to have an understanding of the entire supply chain network. And what we were able to then begin to see is that, well, maybe this isn't the right way to approach this issue, right? Many people asked us, like, can we do the same thing with forced labor that we're doing with environmental LCA? And where we're starting with this question of tackling forced labor in this industry, this proof of concept experiment said basically, well, no, we can't. So, insights. I see your 2 minutes. Is that what you wanted me to say? Yes. Okay, so insight one, what did we learn? So we learned to step back. We learned to step away from methods, tools, data, and data sets. And our team sort of stepped back and we said, let's acknowledge the limitations. The issue is often when presented with oh, we don't have the data, then there's always oh, let's go get it. Can we get this data? We basically just decided that that's not actually the right question. We actually had doubts that a calculation is even the correct approach in a field where data is so scarce and the nature of the problem is actually power-driven and political. Should we start somewhere else? The second insight was we have to be curious about the directionality within the solution space and the flow of money, materials, labor, control, influence, and information. Do we rely, or did we start with a top-down solution? So if we look just simply at this diagram, which is going to be hard to read, so I'm going to point out to where we sit within sort of a flow of extraction, manufacturing, and design and construction, we have gotten really good at understanding supply chains over the last 10 years. Like really good, also at pushing our influence down into supply chains, actually. But then we begin to associate this sort of knowledge of supply chains with all of the factors that are part of this problem. We can begin to really build up a map of flows that does in fact include money, materials, labor, control, influence, and information. And what we began to realize is that our models actually might abstract the problem so much that they are unhelpful in this instance. So who are our nearest neighbors in this map? They happen to be certifications, and we also might, in fact, have a direct link to learning from fair trade organizations. And so maybe our agency should be used differently. And then finally, it just indicated we want to be inspired by the fair trade movement. We began to look at worker-driven supply chain governance, where laborers, their leaders, or worker-led organizations guide goals, projects, and tasks. So we found very specifically the Fair World Project's International Guide to Fair Trade Labels to be incredibly enlightening, specifically for its social criteria that's used to evaluate labels. If we apply that kind of thinking to the certification schemas that we often use, we can, in fact, begin to see a way forward where social criteria becomes part of and integral to what we're doing. So actions, I have 3 slides left. So actions. In the near term, we believe we can advocate for a building material certification approach. In fact, this was, again, our nearest neighbor. We can support efforts to aggregate building material certifications for their integration of social topics. In fact, we can associate this with the bill of materials and with bill of materials in material quantities. And we can begin to advocate that certifications take on this type of criteria. If we look at the common materials framework that's being developed by Mindful Materials, you're going to find that they, in fact, have included an effort under supply chain to address social health and equity. That includes things like supplier human rights policy, assessment of human rights and risks, et cetera. So that is a really good place to start, and it is a great place to leverage our agency. But in the long term, our team came to the conclusion that what we actually need to do is advocate for convergence research efforts to advance supply chain equity. And what do we mean by convergence research? So convergence research is a type of research that, according to the US National Science Foundation, is driven by, quote, a problem of great societal need. The whole point of convergence research is to bridge across disciplines, and also include direct and indirect stakeholders and communities, so that we can actually begin to ask this question: who's missing from the work in our industry, and who needs fair and authentic representation in this work? So work in this space must convene laborers, labor organizers, watchdog organizations, manufacturers, employees, and labor lawyers, fair labor experts, industrial ecologists, manufacturers, supply chain managers, lenders, developers, contractors, architects, owners. I'm probably leaving many people out. But the point is, if we're to create new models of project procurement based on principles of equity and worker empowerment, then we should be looking at this much more broadly. And so we have begun, and this is where we are right now, to basically look at all of the pathways of convergence research that is necessary, and to recognize that, well, yeah, we might in fact need some tools and workflows, but more importantly, we need to look at a much larger effort across industries in order to develop a deeper understanding of supply chains, in order to understand models and how supply chains work, so that we can create models of project procurement that basically lead to or are based on the principles of equity and worker empowerment. Thanks.
Alrighty, so now is when we will be moving over to our Zoom presentation. So do we have someone from, yep, there you go. Hello, Pins, how are you?
I'm fine, thank you.
I saw you for a moment.
I'm here. It's pitch dark around me, but otherwise all is good.
Thank you so much for joining us. I have mentioned to everyone that you are literally pulling an all-nighter for us, which is commonplace in the architectural education. May not be so much in your world. I'm just going to hand it over to you. Can you confirm that audio is going well?
Can I confirm? I can hear you loud and clear.
Wonderful. The stage is yours.
Okay. well, hi everyone. I can't see any faces in the room, so I don't know how many people are there. I can see there's 26 and some people online. So just greetings to everyone, wherever you are. Thank you for having me on the panel. It's really nice to hear it come together and to see the slides and the information and the thinking. I'm gonna look at the clock quickly, remind myself how many minutes I have. And I know I need to share my own slides. I'm gonna do that in a second. But I'm going to talk to you a bit about the situation both here in the UK and kind of internationally, and speak both practically about what can be done and how, and also a bit more conceptually about not succumbing to the overwhelming elements of, oh, where do I start then? And in the preparation for today, the question that Melissa, you touched on earlier about, what of those of you who are joining us in the webinar or in the room might think or feel or do differently tomorrow morning is one that occupies me. So I'm going to try and speak a little bit to that, both kind of now and during the panel. So let me just share my screen and hope to get to the right slide. And if you can see that, I'm just going to hit slideshow with any luck. Can you all see my slide? Somebody answer me.
Yes, we can see you.
Thank you, Philip. Great. So I've only got one slide, you'll be pleased to hear. It may not be short, but hopefully it will be sweet. And I wanted to start a bit by saying kind of who are we talking about? And I think Billy's touched on that already. If you take a life cycle approach from raw material extraction, right through processing, transport, building, moving around at the end, and then even waste and recycling, kind of end of life for building materials. So it's to remind everybody that that's the scope, at least, of what I'm going to talk about, and that isn't, I think we talk about supply chain in the same way that when I was at school, I learned about the food chain, and humans are kind of at the top of this mythical food chain, when in reality it's a system. And a reminder to everybody that this is also a system where it isn't just a process of stuff moves around and goes to one place. There's lots of supply, sub-supply, bits coming in and out, bits being transferred, bits that don't go to plan. So it's having that whole picture that you might think you ordered a certified raw material, and then for whatever reason it gets substituted for something else, either known to you or not known to you. And the same is true of the human beings who you might think are working for you. You think you've got a list, you think you've gone through all the checks, you think you've checked somebody's right to work, their documentation in whichever country you're in, and then you find that in fact that person was ill that day and they asked their brother who was living in the same caravan to turn up for work instead of them. And either that was perceived as completely normal, why wouldn't it be? It might be normal in the country that that person is in, but it would be perceived as a breach of the rules in other places. So it's looking at that whole approach and realizing both the materials wise and the people wise who we're talking about, and then it's not set in black and white, it's a whole mixture of different people. And I think to come to the human side of it, really wanted to emphasize that that includes migrant workers a lot of the time in both raw material extraction and in construction. So there's a picture you can see there, I hope, about, that's the phrasing that's used in the article, immigrant women working in construction in New York. And then if you look at the right-hand side of a picture of sandstone in India, India, of course, a huge country, lots of migration, some of it legacy of colonial history, some of it more modern, some of it to do with the climate crisis, but there's movement of people all over the place, and those are people looking for work, like some of my ancestors and no doubt some of yours. And remembering that at the bottom of the rule of we don't want forced labor is actually lots of people moving around for work who get caught up in a system, and what they want from that system might be different from the people at the top bearing the rules. And I think Billy touched on that already, actually talking to the people who were affected in the first instance and finding out what they really want. So it's just a reminder that that's the approach that all of this work needs to take. It can be landowners, it can be people who have access to something, all of that consideration, if you're at the ground level, is important. And then we come to you all in the room. I'm assuming that most of you are actually working in a built environment context and looking at the designing and the architecture, the building, the contracting, the management of vehicles coming in and out. There's a site, all of those questions. And then going up a level, up to government. And you can see again, I've got a picture there. Here in the UK, we have an anti-slavery commissioner. And on the one hand, that's a good thing because it means that actually the issue of exploitation in the construction sector gets looked at, as you can see from the report that's there. And on the other hand, there are people who say that that's really about immigration control. So it's a sort of long history of how do we manage people coming in and out of the country. Hopefully you're aware, we've just had a change of government for the first time in 14 years in this country. And interestingly, the first thing that got changed was to do precisely with that, to do with immigration and asylum. So it's still a very hot political issue, and it relates to these same questions about work and where work is available and what happens to people who are exploited in it. And then I moved down to the last two pictures and kind of what can we actually all do then? I'm conscious of it, short of time and to keep to it and come to more in the panel. So depending on who you are, I'm going to come to the more conceptual what you can do in the panel, but I've just put some resources there. The bottom right hand one, the yellow one, is a super useful resource. That's actually at the bottom of my list. So it's called Building a Fairer System. You can see that it's from here in the UK. It's a Chartered Institute of Building. It's really, really good because it looks at short, medium, and long term. It's got case studies about how do you deal with modern slavery in the construction sector. So that's the way our law frames forced labor. And it's got kind of just different examples at different stages. So that's a really good place to start if you're just asking yourself, what does this mean and what could I do? And above it, you can see there's also examples of a video. There's something to do with construction sector about actual workforce. So that's the top left-hand side. You can see the foreman in the white hat. So that's designed for workers in the construction industry about what their rights are and what forced labor is and how it manifests itself and what you can do about it. That's on YouTube. And then you can see for one level up for contractors, and then one example from sandstone as a building material to look at more raw material extraction. And then the last one I put, the bottom left-hand corner, is you try to do everything right and it still all goes wrong. So that one, if you Google it about New York University, I felt it was appropriate for a New York audience to have a look at what happened in terms of trying to build a campus in Abu Dhabi and trying to do the right thing by, again, a whole load of migrant workers in the construction sector and how things don't go to plan. And I think that's a useful resource to touch on. So I'm going to leave you before I pass back with just, I think the thing is to think differently about who and what and why and who benefits from exploitation. I discussed with the panel before in the preparation for today, the fact that if you're in that industry and you need work, that's always your prime concern. And forced labor is really quite a small part of a wide range of exploitation that we end up focusing on. And actually, if we talk to those women who are out there on the roads just directing traffic, their issue probably isn't forced labor. So there's a whole range of other things that can be a bit less overwhelming and a bit less legally constraining that I would also encourage you all to look at in the built environment sector. So here are resources specifically for that, to do with forced labor and other things, but there's a whole other world of slightly more readily addressable forced labor and exploitation and worker rights that can be addressed a bit more easily, and we'll come to that in the panel. So I pass back to you, Melissa, with a hope that that was about 7 minutes.
So the other piece I wanted to share with you is a structural piece about our firm. And it is that over the past 20 plus years, we have taken some intentional steps that have prepared us to do this work. And one of those is this initiatives committee structure. So we actually have taken the step, long ago to dedicate time to this type of effort. So even though we're not a big firm, there is a time code everyone can enter on their timesheet that is specifically assigned to advancing these kind of industry-wide conversations, whether it be designing healthy environments or designing equitable environments. And we meet regularly as a group to talk about our goals, to judge how we're doing, and to set our objectives going forward. So what is the issue? And this question of who are the rights holders, this is a question that PINS had posed in a couple of our working sessions. And it really gets back to that idea of designing for people and who is it that we're considering when we're designing. And some groups on here have obviously been overrepresented historically, and some have been underrepresented. Some we may not even be aware of. And I do put the design team on here because I think part of what my involvement in this social science committee has taught me is the importance of naming our own perspective and our own prejudices that we absolutely bring to the table and to this issue. But in every way, this work is really about broadening who we're designing for. So if this were to be our diagram of a traditional design process, there are a few really flawed problems with trying to design for a broader stakeholder group, right? One, on the top corner there, it's all materials. There are no people. We're just thinking of these as materials. And two, there's this big white hole in the middle where there's this sort of knowledge gap between these two streams that then magically come together as this building in this moment. So if we're really serious about doing things differently, we needed to put in place different processes. And so this is part of what we're trying to do. And as a 25-person firm, as much as I would like to be meeting with the different communities at the different extraction points, that's just not realistic. But what is realistic, it's something that we've heard echoed by the other two speakers, is really making use of all of the resources that are out there. So finding the certifications that are doing this work, finding the allies in the industry that we can be speaking with, and then it really does become our responsibility to use those resources. We're also talking about, expanding this so that if we're really talking about the facilities folks as part of this labor issue, then part of that post-occupancy work also has to be part of this, broadening the lens. So how do you pick a project to start with? We've already been doing this work as a firm to kind of prepare ourselves. This particular project was of interest because it's institutional, because the client is mission aligned, because it's adaptive reuse, and because it's urban. So there are certainly questions of what do we build, how much do we build? And so starting with an adaptive reuse project really felt appropriate to us. And then remembering that there are some really simple overarching principles. So while this is big and complex, there are actually some really basic, just good design principles that do lead us to some low-hanging fruit. So these are some things that, we're keeping in mind on every project and circling back to regularly, so that when we get to this long list of materials that goes into any building project, we're not overwhelmed. We have a good starting point of how to actually tackle this list. The next thing we're doing is analyzing, well, where should we focus in that list? And this simple graph is based on the Carnegie project that we're starting. We took a preliminary cost estimate, and we're graphing both the volume of materials we're using and the dollar value of the materials that we're using. And what we're seeing here is that gypsum, just regular old wallboard, is something that is going to be significantly represented in the project, both in terms of volume and in terms of dollar value. And this is true for a lot of our work. So this, for us, seems like a really good starting point then. So from there, what we're doing, in the process of doing, is doing a deep dive into gypsum. And again, we're not traveling around the world to accomplish this, but We are assembling the wealth of resources that are already out there, including the Design for Freedom resources, and looking at, the goal here is not to say, oh, well, maybe we should never use gypsum again, or to say, oh, well, we're going to, select this one good gypsum and all the others are bad gypsum. But we can make better choices. We can use this data to make incrementally better choices, and that matters. And then the last piece that I wanted to end on is just to say that this is an iterative process. So part of the work is doing this research and applying it on a single project, but part of the work is also being here this evening and having these discussions, and part of the work is finding these allies and finding these certifications that we can work with, and that in this way we think we can make not only incremental change, but together we can make significant change. That's it.
Well, thank you again to each of our panelists. What a fascinating conversation. I'm going to start with a softball question for each of you, allowing a bit of underlining some of the things that we had an opportunity to just hear. So starting with you, Billy. You spoke, I think, quite expertly about the connection between the work that you've been doing and the work of the Social Science and Architecture Committee, really trying to understand social information in a different capacity, in some ways almost retraining ourselves as architects who are often focused on exceptional documentation of non-human things. But then you also confessed that there was as much that you learned that you didn't know or didn't work throughout the process. And I'm wondering if you could share a little bit more about that kind of tension between the things that we might take as an assumption going in, or we might already be good at in thinking from an architectural lens, and the things that we might need to unlearn or think about differently in order to be more successful in this area. I'm sure it will come on momentarily. Give it 30 seconds.
Okay, so I appreciate you saying that I spoke expertly, because you admitted, what did you say? Imposter? You used the imposter? Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons why I talked a little bit about who was on our team is because we purposefully engage topics like this through a transdisciplinary approach, recognizing that often there are questions of such a large scale and magnitude with so much complexity that we need to go outside of the profession of architecture alone and begin to bring other people into these discussions. And not only that, be able to have a level of, begin to gain a level of perspective about how different disciplines begin to view these types of questions of forced labor. And so that is one of the primary ways that I have oriented myself personally to my work, but everybody on our team has oriented themselves to this work. And the reason why I can speak the way I can speak about this is because I've learned from people on my team who have challenged me with facts, with ideas, with ways of seeing things and seeing things differently. I certainly begin this conversation from that upper right-hand corner, trained as an architect, but also a researcher, but also a transdisciplinarian. It's quite something. I think the posture of learning is really fundamental to this topic.
Thank you. I appreciate that comment. The posture of learning. Shall we each practice that posture? But then you also mentioned complexity, which is going to bring me over to pins. Pins, one of the things that you've really been, I think, quite thoughtful about in our prep conversations, reminding us to keep things simple in order to make action possible. And you've mentioned some of the things that are going on around the world, and even your single slide made it clear that through simplicity we might be better able to accomplish that actionability. I'm wondering if you might further underline some of that theme from your perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really familiar to me. Can I just check that you can hear me?
We can hear you, and now we can see you as well.
I'm not looming over you like big sister. So yeah, that it can be really overwhelming. I think just being a human individual thinking I'm trying to do my best in between all the other things, and where does that start? And to me, I would summarize that the starting simple would just start asking questions and be aware that I know it's a real cliche, but everybody starts just somewhere. And looking at Sarah's example of a specific build and remembering that there's a periphery and then there's a center, and right on the periphery might be what's being mined to make the gypsum, or the aluminium going into those steel frames in Sarah's example. And at the same time, there might be people right on that site who are undocumented or who are underrepresented. Like you said, people are overrepresented, underrepresented. So you can start. There's a really good Arthur Ashe quote. I don't know how well known Arthur Ashe is in the States at this stage. Okay, Melissa's shaking her head. He's an American tennis player, now dead, but famous and unusual. And Arthur Ashe, it's a quote from Arthur Ashe: "Start where you are, use what you have, do what you can." And I have it stuck on my wall here. It's as a post-it note of when I get overwhelmed. It's like, okay, you can do that. You can start where you are, like literally. So in Sarah's example, that would be, you have the projects in front of you. Just as you said, you look at the volume and value of what you spend. That always makes me think of the film Jerry Maguire, show me the money. Okay, show me the money. Follow the money, folks. I know Marx is not popular on your side of the pond. I'm not saying he's popular here, but looking at who benefits and where the money is going is usually a good place to start if you are overwhelmed about where to start. So start where you are, follow the money, do what you can, use what you have.
Thank you, Pins. Appreciate that. We've got a bunch of motivational speakers here for you this evening. So over to you, Sarah. I appreciated the way you started with the culture of your own organization and some of the things that were already part of who you are. You're getting started on this pilot, and that pilot, I think, is so many things. It's an experiment about the process, it's an experiment about the network, about what you do know, what you don't know, but then, of course, also the future building that will be an opportunity to demonstrate this. And I think that's a great example or approach, particularly in our architectural discipline, because we're always looking for the so what at the end. I'm wondering if you might share a bit more about either the things you're hoping to learn or the things that you're finding are either coming naturally to you as you embark on this project, and by you I mean your team, the things that seem to be coming naturally and the things that seem to be a little bit more of a stretch or a push about how you're approaching it.
So I think in terms of well, you started out. I think I'm going to echo a little bit what you said at the beginning about not so much architects being trained to think they know everything, but the ability to kind of take a step without knowing everything, And I do think that that's part of any good design process, is knowing which questions need to be answered at different points in the process, and which questions you really need to set aside until, that it's premature to try to answer. So that ability to make decisions despite the complexity, I actually think that is something that architects and designers are very well trained for. That design thinking is extraordinarily helpful in. I do think the piece that is hard is learning about all of the folks along the way. And, you know, coming out of my connection with the Social Science Committee and out of our mission, there is a real desire from my team to support that kind of bottom-up approach, and a real frustration with not being able to know more, with not being able to have more of those conversations with the folks who are impacted day to day. And so I do think there are stories and there are glimpses. You know, we can listen and we can ask, but that piece I do foresee being an ongoing frustration as we try to do this work.
Excellent, thank you for that, Sarah. In addition to, Billy, start over. It's too bad when you try to say 6 things all at the same time and they get jumbled. Alrighty, Pins mentioned a bit about politics and also a bit about this sort of continuum where, you know, certainly at the extreme end of that continuum is some of the atrocities that we see in regard to global slave labor. But at the other end of that spectrum is maybe things that are just modest abuses of power right in our backyard, literally in our backyard, working in our homes, or part of the aspects of the construction industry that we might be able to have a little bit more sense of control over or proximity to. It is a social science phenomena that we do tend to have more of a sense of urgency and attentiveness to the things that are near or better known, as opposed to the things that are far or, you know, more complicated, et cetera. So I'm wondering, we have recently some speculation here in the United States about the intent to dismantle OSHA, which is the organization that is responsible for rules and regulations around how workers are treated on site. And that's certainly part of what falls into our remit as architects, both in our own workplaces, as well as having some responsibilities for construction administration. I'm wondering if you might just kind of bring some of the things that you're trying to do and some of the things that you're thinking about on this global slavery topic to the things that you might address day to day, whether it be OSHA or other opportunities to see how work is really going on in the parts of the construction site or supply chain that we can see more locally. And since you're nodding along, Sarah, I'm going to make you hit this one first, and then I'll go to Billy.
So I think there are a couple of things. I think one piece I want to address is the political piece of that question. And I do think there's another quote that comes to mind for me from a political activist whose work is, she has a Substack that is titled Chop Wood, Carry Water. And the point is very simply that politics are going to go all over the map, but we have our work to do each day, and those are simple things, and even if politics are swinging this way or that way, you get up each morning and you chop wood and you carry water, because that's what you need to do. So one, I don't want to get too caught up in the politics, because I think it can be distracting from our work. I think the other piece of that is really sort of a question about the role of regulation, and there's the floor and the ceiling, right? Like there are always going to be job sites where we need those minimum protections, and we found the same thing with the energy code, right? There are buildings that, you know, no matter how much we educate the clients, they're going to do the bare minimum, either because that's what they can afford or, you know, for whatever reason, maybe justified, maybe not, but that regulation serves a real purpose in establishing a floor, but that can't be the only way that we're making change, right? So how do you both have that floor, but also kind of reach in the other direction?
No, I think it's, given the fact that when we started this conversation, we started with a fact about how many workers in this country are actually under conditions or experiencing all of the indicators of forced labor. And so when you talk about OSHA and we talk about worker safety, that of course is one of the indicators that someone is in a forced labor condition when worker safety is compromised or conditions are in fact unsafe. And when we begin to question that system and we begin to undermine the protections in place of workers, it just seems to me that that begins to feed into a whole other series of protections that we might start to undermine. And that's a really difficult conversation to have. And I think it gets back to what Penn's and we were all trying to indicate, is that there's a layer of this conversation that is deeply connected to politics of power and who has it and who doesn't. It's disturbing.
Thank you for that, and maybe a shout out to some other social science and architecture programming. I think that your Chop Wood and Carry Water, Sarah, is really about a values-driven practice and the ways that you bring that to your work every day, whether that be the designing of a building or the politics around ensuring a level of safety and a commitment to the community around us. Thank you both for your thoughts on that question. Pins, may I invite you to comment on either what Billy or Sarah just said there about kind of the work that we do adjacent to the politics around us?
Yeah, I mean, I think the work, I don't even know if it is adjacent. It's just sort of different types of politics, isn't it? You know, small p politics and big P politics. And as you mentioned, Melissa, it's about power, and politics is about power of different forms mediated between different people. And so that's where I just come back to, as you said, about your own backyard and doing things differently, and that you can always do things differently in communities in the way that you work. And we've heard some examples this evening, and it makes me think of getting away from the examples, the bit that demonstrating that it can be done differently, even in a small way, and sharing the demonstration is really important. I'm part of a group here, just it's totally kind of random group of people trying to look at regenerative practices. And we have a network which is called STEPS, STEPS, and the STEPS stands for Show the Easy Place to Start. And that's the idea of it. Everyone says, okay, regeneration, it's the latest buzzword. What does it really mean? And I'm sure it's the same in construction. It's like, okay, here are these examples, but how do I really get going? Is that in my community? Is it at work, or paid work at least? Or is it in unpaid work? As you said, chop wood, fetch water. It made me think it's very gendered. I have an Afghan neighbor who once laughed. He was sitting in my living room, and my dad was here. My dad is he was then in his late 70s, and my dad was telling my now ex-husband that he should have been bringing in the wood, because I was bringing in some wood from outside. And my Afghan neighbor turned to my dad and he said, in Afghanistan, bringing in wood is women's work. So I think for me, that's also a part of this, right? Is who's doing which work and who is holding these conversations and mediating this power. So for me, that's something we should discuss here as well. Is as I said, kind of migration, who holds which status, the right to work, supposedly the not right to work, who benefits from withholding someone else's right to work. And while you were talking earlier, I pulled off my bookshelf here in my office a book that I worked on a long time ago. I speak Italian, and I worked for the British NGO Anti-Slavery International, and I did some work with a colleague in Italy with Romanian workers in the construction sector. And I'm going to tell you the short story by way of answering your question about what can you do, which is there's a bunch of Romanian workers. They were all working in Italy. They've been there some time. This is the short version. And the then Prime Minister, coming back to politics, this is a long time ago, declared an amnesty for undocumented workers. And so the Romanian workers went to the construction site manager and showed all the paperwork of how they'd been, or showed the pay they'd been receiving, and said, look, we want to be able to go to the authorities, the local municipality, show our paperwork that we have been working, and then we can start to regularize our status. And the construction site manager, who was Italian, said, great, I'll meet you tomorrow. Can you bring all the other crew? We'll all sit down and go through the paperwork, and we'll start the process of getting you regularized. And the following day, I regret to say that when the crew of workers arrived at the construction site, they found the charred body of the foreman, and the site manager had burnt to death the foreman to demonstrate to the others what would happen to them if they tried to regularize their status. And so that case, obviously horrific for all the people involved. The leader of the construction team had been an engineer in Romania. He was the person who spoke the most Italian. Italian was quite close to Romanian, and that had been done to him to make an example of him, to show what happens if you try to claim your power. And I think we need to be aware, this is what I mean, there's forced labor, then there's all the other stuff going on that isn't forced labor, but we can address differently, we can act fairly, we can treat people with dignity, we can treat people with respect. And then we need to be aware that there's also a side going on which is criminal. And when we talk to the trade union movement, and you mentioned that earlier, Billy, about in the research where you talk to unions about what goes on, you can get into the frightening side of it. So it's about being aware of what you're dealing with sometimes when you mess with a system which benefits some people and doesn't benefit other people. So it's a long-winded answer, but it's something that stayed with me ever since, about being careful as well, and making sure that when you try to act from outside, you're really super careful about how you represent those people's interests if you're not a part of that particular situation. You don't make assumptions.
Yeah, thank you for that, Pins, and a poignant reminder that this is not just about, the day-to-day political dynamic or the practical detail of people being paid for their work, et cetera. There's so many other things that layer into this, the sex or gendered sexism that you mentioned. I'm also thinking of terrorism, right? When there is an act of violence that is extreme in nature, it sends messages not just throughout a community, but even across communities around the world, into diaspora, et cetera. And so in reflecting on this relationship between sort of the local and the addressable and the distant, I think one of the things that I've thought a lot about is the 6 individuals who perished in the Francis Scott Key Baltimore Bridge incident, 6 construction workers that are in our industry, none of whom were US citizens. Those folks hailed from Mexico, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. And I think that we'd be having a different conversation about that incident if those were American citizens or people born in America, in the United States, that had been part of that tragedy. And I think that the moment of that has not lasted long enough in our collective conversation. I do want to open up an opportunity for a couple of questions from the audience. Speaking of labor, we do have to be completely out of here by 8 o'clock so that the fabulous folks at the AIA NYN Center for Architecture can have their work-life balance. But I would love to take a couple questions from the audience, and then I'll take the floor back so that we can have a couple speed round questions. And Salmata, thank you. We've got a mic on its way. You didn't even have to raise your hand. Was it like a little nod? Yeah, I like it. Would you mind letting us know who you are as you ask the question?
Of course. My name is Sarah Kenny. I specialize in architecture research. So I really liked the quote that Pins gave us. Start where you are, use what you have, do what you can. So for somebody who is currently starting an architecture research nonprofit practice that is specializing in field research. What are things that you guys, I noticed Billy specifically was talking about a lot of lack of ground truthing. What are things that you wish you had knowledge access to that can only be discovered from field research that would benefit your, either your research practice or also your architectural practice? And to add another layer to that, what are some questions that you think will be answered in the next 5 years versus some questions that you think are not already being addressed? That's someone just getting started. We'll do it now. That way for 5 years.
Awesome. The second half of your question is part of our speed round. So let's focus on starting a design and design research practice and reflections on some of the important elements in the world of field research.
Okay, so the first piece, I'm going to echo kind of the frustration that I shared with Melissa earlier, as well as I think part of what Pins was telling us through the cautionary tale that she just shared. And that really is that social science work of actually hearing from the folks who are most impacted. And, you know, that's really complex, like how we ask those questions while protecting them and making sure that even in our asking of those questions, we're not increasing their risk. It's not easy information to gather, but I don't think that we'll ever have the whole path forward or the whole solution without that piece of it, is really hearing from those folks who are most impacted. And so that's the piece that in my practice I think would be most valuable.
Learning to listen.
Well, not so much, part of it is learning to listen, but since I can't be there having all of those conversations, you know, if you are embarking on a kind of research study of all those certifications and the kind of the tools that I showed in the middle of that diagram, I feel like that's the piece that we know the least about, and that is the most missing from that kind of, you know, certification and data set that I'm familiar with to date.
Yeah, it's really great to hear that you're starting a research practice. Research is, I believe, research is an incredible form of agency in our profession. And I think that you're likely trying to figure out what your research infrastructure is and what do you really need to conduct this work. And to be able to show that it's a rigorous pursuit that involves people, time, money, knowledge. It's not something to be done on the side, that it's actually something to be done centrally, proves the point that we need knowledge workers within our profession to use the built environment as a way to demonstrate what we've done and what we're doing and what we can do. So congratulations to you starting your research practice. That's quite something. With every question I've learned in my career, I've worked with many researchers and across many different fields, hybridizing different methods and approaches, keeping an open mind, being willing to learn from others, as I said earlier, has been one of the keys to successful field research for us and for the work that we've done. Being willing to go into something as a learner has been absolutely important. To keep a point of impartiality as you're asking a question, and also being willing, as I showed earlier, to be wrong. We proved the null hypothesis here. I mean, it's not something that we've actually, this is the first time we've shared this, that we tried something and we failed, right? So, being wrong is a really important form of feedback for our industry. Yeah. I agree. So I didn't answer your question.
I think we're good.
But I think you want a workshop. I think that's what you're angling for.
Come to a committee meeting. Do we have some more questions? At the back? Oh, sorry, yep, at the front. don't forget to introduce yourself.
Kind of the difficulty of making sure you're asking questions but also not putting people at risk. So I was wondering, are there any like new technologies or apps or sort of ways of gathering information without having to like go onto the site and making people feel really uncomfortable, especially if you're not maybe from their community or experiencing the things they're experiencing, like any types of new apps that are kind of doing that work for you?
So I have to repeat the questions. So a bit of a question around certainly the sort of social safety that you mentioned, Sarah, and then particularly as it relates to that and the way to both hear and understand those perspectives, but also to have maybe a mediated conversation that might be enabled through apps or technology.
So I can't speak to the app or technology piece of it, but I can share, one important lesson I learned in working with a social scientist on a pilot study, and that was really the importance of building a diverse team, and a team that included folks from the community that we were trying to study. So, when I showed that slide at the beginning that showed we're women-owned and we work to advance diversity in our practice and across the profession, I do feel like that is absolutely critical and has to be pushed so much further if we're really going to ask these questions, of different communities around the world.
I love that there's a supply chain issue there embedded, because if we don't educate a diverse set of architects, then we don't hire a diverse set of architects, then we don't have them to deploy to communities that they might have more commonality with and have opportunities for connection and making that safe space. So thank you, appreciate that. Pins, you're our scout around the world on things that might be applications here. Do you have any thoughts that might inform this question around methods for listening that might enable more social safety for those who are sharing information about their experiences?
Yeah, I mean, I have, as I didn't really declare at the beginning, but I have much more experience in agriculture, but you may have spotted by the chair of the Food Network. So most of my career has been on labor rights and now relating to climate, but in food and kind of agricultural commodities, both here in the UK and in Europe and globally, tea, avocados, all sorts of random things. And in the food industry, there are apps that do I hesitate to say worker voice, because that kind of, we're moving into worker organization, trade unions, that's a different thing. So sort of meaningful worker representation via collective bargaining, one thing. I haven't seen trade unions using apps particularly in my time, but what I have seen much more recently, is ways of collecting information from people that tries to do the social safeguarding. And the two things that I've learnt, in case it's of use to the questioner, is most people just don't want to give their opinion. On the whole, most people are just trying to go to work, earn their living, go back home. That's it. They don't want to answer questions, and sometimes that's to do with whether they're documented or not. And sometimes it's nothing to do with that. It's just it's not how they function. And then there is a fewer people who are willing to give their opinion. And so some of the way to break that barrier is to offer training at the same time. So I've seen really recently, literally like a couple of months ago, from a food business here in the UK, where a person working on the site in human resources and site management had used AI to develop a really brilliant app that trained people on health and safety on the site, and then took their input as part of the training. And so it was a kind of twofold way. And obviously people were told that. They were told that their opinions were being collected as well. But it was a way in to get a much broader thing than trying to run a survey where people don't want to ask the survey, or as you said, kind of turning up onto a work site in a way that is overbearing. So yeah, that's a way I've seen it done most recently. And the way they were using AI was to put it all into appropriate languages and to change all of the signage on the app, and for people to upload just with QR codes around the physical site. So you would walk up to a particular farm gate and you would scan in a QR code, you'd get the health and safety download, and then you'd get the health and safety information with a question about something else. And so one unlocked the other. And that was working very well. And they developed it themselves, but they were going to try and refine it and then at least open source it in the food industry. I've seen it in South Africa, for example, where obviously a history of pretty extreme, well, even the word race relations doesn't sound right, extreme racism, exploitation that went side by side. And how do you deal with that with a kind of color almost hierarchy that exists in South African businesses and South African supply chains, and trying to collect worker voice in that context. And there it's also been quite effective because there's much more history of speaking up in South Africa and safety in the trade union movement.
Thank you for that, Pins. I'll also offer a shout out to a product called SourceMap that was founded by a guy named Leonard Banani, who's educated as an architect, but actually took his systems thinking approach and went into really crowdsourced information around supply chain. And he has also presented here at the AIA NY as well. So a bit of a shout out to that app, as well as others that are working on this problem that Billy has highlighted for us, which is that you can't fix a bottom-up problem with a top-down system, or vice versa. In any case, if we look at it from the top down, we're not going to figure out what is going on, and we need to enable different approaches of information. Time for one last question, and then we are going to do that speed round. And we've got a question at the way back. Oh, sorry.
Okay. Hi, I'm Todd. I'm Todd Zhu. I just started my career in this industry. I would like to ask something that might not exactly related to today's topic, but maybe it is. Melissa, you mentioned all-nighter, and we all know there is a culture in our industry of voluntary overtime. And in that context, there was an attempt to unionize in this city. I would like to hear what the panelists think in response to the things that's going on. And yeah, I would like to hear your comments.
We have had an entire panel on unionization and architecture. I would refer you to that, but maybe give Sarah a quick chance to answer. We do have some online questions that hopefully we could record or track down those questions, and if you have submitted an online question, we will aim to get back to you in order to address that, and can aim to do so in a public forum. But I'm going to let Sarah answer the in-room question, and then we're going to do our speed round.
So I do definitely recognize that labor issues exist in our practice as well. And I do think that that's something that, we've all sort of touched on, is starting at home. And, I don't, union or not union, to me, there are a lot of different variables in that, and I'm not going to come down on one side or the other of that. I've seen good examples and I've seen bad examples. But I do think that there are things, again, within each of our practices that we can be doing, like auditing our pay scales and checking that for equity, making sure that we're paying interns. And, so that there are simple steps that are not to say, oh, the politics don't matter, but that we can take while we kind of work through some of these other issues.
Thank you. So on to our speed round. I'm going to do just one of these because it was brought up by one of our audience members. And that is, we'll go in the order of your original presentations, just to give you a heads up on what that's going to be. What is something that you would like to see happen in the next few years, or what is a wish or a dream that you have in regard to the topic areas that we've been discussing this evening? And I'm going to make you go first, Billy.
Yeah, I'm gonna just start where I think our team landed. I mean, we were all learning from each other, but we also recognized the need for education regarding the conditions that drive labor exploitation. No doubt that this conversation tonight has been, it's difficult. It's difficult to navigate all of these dynamics and to feel that we have any agency whatsoever in this space. Education is what I want to see happen. A deep program of education that allows us to understand what does drive labor exploitation, what are those dynamics, and how do we begin to really understand root causes.
So maybe labor practices in the professional practice curriculum in our architectural education? Amazing. All right, want to make sure that it's got to be precise if we're going to make it happen.
I don't think it's not the sort of factory model of from the academy to practice, and we transform practice. We are constantly transforming ourselves in practice through practice. And so I think it's a both and.
All right, over to you, Pins.
Sorry, did you say you were coming to me?
Yes, it's if you were queen for a day, what thing would you like to have happen in the near future relative to this topic?
God, I had an answer and now it's gone out of my head. And it was a genuine thing that just kind of came to me listening. Can you go to Sarah and I'll try and remember what it was?
Sarah's ready. Go.
So for the short term, this is for the short term?
We're only going to do one
Okay.
question.
We're gonna do this pilot project and we're gonna learn from it. And I think that's the easy one for the short term. And the kind of long-term dream world is that everyone has agency over their work, where they work and what conditions they work under, what they work on, how they work. So that agency is my long-term dream.
Excellent, thank you for that. Pins, have you remembered?
No. Which is annoying because it was good. It was like, I thought, that's a good idea. But it's gone out of my head. And I think my boring answer, which is not really the dream, but it's about sort of integrating it into the systems. So I hear that Billy's point about what's in the curriculum and how does it even fall, how does it not fall in the curriculum, right? And now I remember, that's helpful. But it was to do with climate. It was to do with actually looking at it the other way around, which is if what we're trying to do is human rights and social equity, and we're focusing on the production from raw materials up to it. Actually, if we look at the consumption, and I think both Billy and Melissa touched on this, Billy and Sarah touched on this, that we know that the IPCC reporting has focused so much on production, right? There's too much focus on what's happening and let's breathe down the necks of India and China. And the reality is in the construction sector, at least in the UK, and we mentioned this in the practice sessions, 20% of the materials are wasted in building site construction, 20%. So we need to look at the consumption side and say, how are we ending up wasting all of those materials? So this is the both and is like, hang on a minute, because the wastage of those materials is causing massive detriment through the waste of materials and the extraction of those materials. So it's not just saying, okay, could we improve the lives of bonded laborers in sandstone? It's also saying, but hang on, why are we wasting over here and looking at our per capita consumption and where is the construction sector contributing to that wastage? Because that's part of the root cause of the overall problem. And that in 5 years' time, we would have understood that better and students would understand that better and look at it from that angle too, and join those dots between the overall overuse of materials and how we contribute to that, not just the materials that we're actually buying. I'm glad it came back to me. It would have annoyed me. I would have gone to bed going, oh.
Thank you again, Pins. Really appreciate that. And while I opened with a remark about architects being trained to learn, to know everything, I'll close with an observation that we do tend to be passionate about our communities and systems thinkers. We see things connected where other people don't see those dots connected. And so on that, I would like to thank our hosts, the Social Science and Architecture Committee, our panelists. We are going to break here. I do ask that you make sure to have a little bit of social time. I think we've got some snacks to finish up, and then make your way out, and you can complete your socialization out on the street in the fabulous warm weather. And thank you all for coming out this evening. And do not forget to ask the question of where did this come from and who was involved in its production. Thank you.